Welcome to the Investment Banking Leaders Podcast, brought to you by the Investment Banking Leaders Club, your exclusive access to the industry's most successful leaders. These experts have closed thousands of deals, generating hundreds of billions of dollars, and they're here to share their strategies, insights, and leadership lessons that can fast-track your career. But the learning doesn't stop here. Join the Investment Banking Leaders Club at ibleadersclub.com for even more exclusive insights, leadership frameworks, and career accelerating resources and events. Thanks for joining us, and best of luck on your growth journey. I am pumped to be joined today by Aaron Schwimmer, partner at MTS Health Partners, a leading boutique investment bank which is focused exclusively on the healthcare industry. Now, Aaron's path into investment banking was anything but conventional. He started in a lab before moving to equity research at Goldman, and then transitioning into business development for MedImmune, before ultimately finding his stride in banking at Barclays and Bank of America, before landing at MTS. And Aaron's unique 25-year journey and multi-dimensional experience has really shaped the way that he leads today. It's given him unusually well-rounded lens on leadership, communication, and of course, value creation as well. And it's that breadth that's become a superpower in how he manages his clients and builds his teams. So in this episode, we're going to explore how Aaron's early career outside of banking gave him a differentiated edge, how his leadership style, including how he manages up, down, and across, and also the lessons he's learned about building trust, growing teams, and guiding clients through high-stake healthcare transactions. We're super excited to get into this, and welcome to the Investment Banking Leaders Podcast, Aaron.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Excited to get going.
Awesome. Let's start at the beginning. You've had a unique path, as I mentioned, into investment banking, starting in the lab before moving to equity research and then business development. Can you take us through that journey? And I guess what originally drew you into the finance world?
Sure. I'll start way back. I had a bachelor's in biology. Didn't have a great idea about what to do with that from a career perspective. Certainly never thought about it in the business context. Ended up at a lab at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And I think over 6 to 9 months, maybe a year, discovered that probably wasn't my best path forward. Around that time, my wife was working as a biotech recruiter and was sending me equity research on biotech companies just because we were both involved in the sciences. And it was from when Hambrecht and Quist was still an independent bank before they were acquired by JP Morgan. And I was really fascinated by that content. Through a friend, I got an interview with Goldman's healthcare equity research team, thinking I would go in through healthcare IT for some background with my father being a physician and difficulty dealing with managed care, stuff like that. But I showed up for the interviews with a bachelor's in biology, and also at a time when the sector was really exploding as they neared completion of the mapping of the human genome. And so I think it was and everyone needs these at least once, if not multiple times throughout their career. I think it was a right place, right time spot, and you needed people in biotech just given the pace of activity and the phone calls and how everything was developing around the companies and specialty investors in the sector, and it was all happening at the same time. And I started in January of 2000 on the biotech equity research team at Goldman, and that was when I really started my first exposure to biotech, learning about how dynamic it was, and not to be cheesy, but really fell in love with the space and what it represented in terms of innovation and the type of people I was working with on the client side. So over that 5-year period, I was determined to go into industry. And in that 5-year period, they passed Reg FD. So the role of an analyst relative to the client they were covering changed a little bit. And so I wanted to go and learn it from the inside out. I assumed I would need an MBA to do that. But as I started talking to some of the biotech companies that we were covering at Goldman, MedImmune invited me to come down and interview for the BD team. And I started there as a manager. And that was really exactly what I thought it would be. Through my role in the business development team and sourcing, diligencing, and executing on deals, you get through that seat to interact with the entire organization, particularly at a place like MedImmune, which was sold for $16 billion. But when I joined as a very, very junior guy, it was still $1 billion, $2 billion company. Unlike pharma, we didn't really have independent diligence team. So if you wanted to learn something about a clinical trial in oncology, you would go the guy that was running oncology clinical trials for MedImmune across the board. Same thing with manufacturing. MedImmune had a legendary manufacturing team. If you were doing something on antibody purification or engineering, you would go to the people that did it. And that was really an amazing experience for me in twofold, not only in terms of the content, but I think transitioning out of finance and into an organization that had a relative, compared to finance in general, my experience at Goldman specifically had a very different kind of organizational leadership kind of structure to it, which is, I don't think a Goldman versus MedImmune thing. I think it's a finance versus not finance thing. And so those two things, the content, the relationship building, leadership, that were all things that I really developed at MedImmune. And then when that company was sold, I had two routes. I could go do more BD finance stuff in biotech. I had a couple of offers at small companies. But then I looked at banking and investment banking covering biotech and thought my market perspective from Goldman Sachs, my content from MedImmune, you put those two things together, and maybe that makes for a relatively dangerous banker. And that's what I started with. And most of my career, as you mentioned, Peter, was at Barclays and Bank of America, two very big banks. But then recently, about a year ago, transitioned to MTS, which is a smaller bank that just does healthcare.
I love the journey, Aaron. Thanks for sharing. And it's super
Yeah.
unique. I've spoken to a ton of leaders over the last couple of years, and it's few that actually step out across to the other side, if you will, and learn that part of the business and come back. But everyone I speak to really gains from it. So, with that role in equity research and business development, how did it shape your perspective as a banker?
I think when you're an equity research analyst, I've been out of that business for a while, but certainly in 99, 2000, 2001, you're on the front line. So it's not like they spoon feed you content and capabilities and work you up the ladder and then you're talking to clients. I remember picking up calls from clients very early on in my tenure at Goldman Sachs just because our analyst, and I was working for a very well known analyst at the time, but she just couldn't handle the volume. So inevitably, you're put on the front line, and it's a trial by fire situation. So I think that was the beginning of my comfort level with being in front of clients, sometimes in a way where you're uncomfortable, because I was definitely over my skis at the beginning and probably throughout my tenure at Goldman, just given the quality of investors that I was talking to and their experience. But you had to do what you had to do to advance your analyst business as a whole, and certainly your set of capabilities as an individual analyst. So I think that's where it really started to develop a comfort with that and developing my own content to put behind that. So not just taking what was in my analyst note, but trying to do a level deeper of work where I could take that content and developing an interesting relationship with our institutional investing clients. So that was that piece of it. And then I think that the tenure at MedImmune, also a different type of content. I would describe equity research as it's a mile wide and it's certainly not an inch deep. It's a foot or two deep. My analyst was unbelievably determined to do every piece of diligence she could, but there's limitations to your day and you're covering a big universe. So I think it's wider and shallower maybe from a content perspective, and working at MedImmune is all about MedImmune. So you're a little bit narrower, but you're a lot deeper, right? So you're thinking about MedImmune at multiple levels: strategic, financial, innovation, technical, things like that. So I think that was the matrix that worked for me as I transitioned into covering companies as a banker.
I love that. And the contact creation, the expertise as well, that obviously must have given you the platform for, and the client exposure earlier. I love
Yeah,
that. I guess baptism by fire, as you put it, but
yeah, for
definitely
sure.
understand why that gave you really great foundations. Working outside traditional investment banking, when we chatted, you felt it gave you a kind of a different way to understand clients and build relationships internally with your teams. How did it help in these areas?
I think there's a way of doing things in finance and doing things out. Like when I showed up at MedImmune, we had a great BD team. We had a really good VP at the time, a really strong. And I remember I was assigned a project to go figure out the antibody engineering space because MedImmune had a prolific protein engineering, manufacturing capabilities. One of the first companies, I think the first company to launch a antibody for infectious disease. And I was naive in thinking like, being aware of MedImmune's capabilities in that, but not necessarily appreciating that was the door to go through, as opposed to being an analyst where you're trained to, I have to develop my own opinion based on the facts that I can diligence and then present that to my client. So I went into, I take this project away. I come back to the VP and I'm like, this is, what I think of the space and the pros and the cons. And, I think the feedback was, we're not looking for your opinion. We have the best people in the world at this company that do this for a living. It wasn't quite that black and white, but that was more or less the tone of it. You have to go into the organization and build a consensus and build relationships, not from a top down way, like you often do in finance. So when I left Goldman, I was an associate managing an analyst, and there wasn't that level of hierarchy at MedImmune. So I'm talking to a VP of clinical development, an SVP of manufacturing, an associate director in program trial management, all that stuff. So I had to develop different ways of approaching those relationships rather than I'm a senior and you're a junior. So I think that had a different level of capabilities that I internalized at MedImmune. And then I think when you present that back to clients as a covering investment banker, I think it's less tangible, but I think there's a level of normalcy to that conversation and that way of approaching people and talking to them that I think at some level the clients I was covering as a banker appreciated.
Yeah, and I can definitely understand why that's a strong area to develop and how that can be useful in the banker role. Let's stick in that a little bit. Obviously, I guess more so in the leadership side, given that's the central theme of the podcast. What kind of leadership lessons and habits stuck with you from your time outside of banking? Because you just mentioned that top down, which is obviously really traditional, especially in the bulge bracket space. So what lessons or leadership lessons stuck with you, you took away from your time?
I think do your work. My job as manager, senior manager, or associate director at MedImmune, if I'm doing my job well, then it makes the diligence process efficient for everyone involved, right? So I think to dig a little bit deeper on that in a more simplistic framework, but I think it's the difference between showing up at a diligence meeting and asking for people's opinions and feedback and trying to score it in a black and white way. Are we yes? Are we no? But showing up with an informed view of where we are in that process, not just going through everyone's individual feedback, but summarizing the feedback in a pros and cons type of way that allows the collective group to take the conversation forward. And I think I still apply that in some form to the way I work with junior bankers at the VP associate analyst level, is that I show up and have a perspective on not just what we want to do for that part, that analysis, but more specifically how we want to do it, and it's starting with the message of what we're trying to get out of it, right? So it's my job to have a perspective that I can communicate and share with the junior team in a clear way. And then that allows them, and whatever level of guidance I give them on how to support that, it can vary sometimes depending on the project, the time, who's involved, etc. But if I start with that central premise that I framed in my mind based on the work I've done with that client and how I'm approaching this specific analysis, it makes their job a lot easier.
So
Right.
it's
So
really set.
I think that's kind of how I've tried to apply my leadership style that I developed at MedImmune and brought to investment banking over time.
So it's really doing the work that's needs done to really set that perspective, that purpose for what you're going after, and translating that well to the team. Did I understand that
Right.
correctly?
So here, this is the agenda for the meeting, right? It's easy for me to say we want A, B, and C, right? We want something like a situation overview, positioning, ideas, whatever. I can say all those things. That's a standard agenda for most biotech banking meetings. But I think the job to both make it interesting for myself, the team, and the clients is to say, this is the general agenda, and here's why I asked for the meeting, right? Because I think
Got
you've
you.
got to have a why, right? Anytime you go into a client as a banker, here's why I asked for meeting. Here's why they asked us for the meeting. Here's what I want to get out of it. Here's what they want to get out of it. And how do we put all that together into a cohesive yet efficient analysis? So I think that's the right way to communicate as a leader. And I also think it makes the work product a lot better at the end of the day.
Yeah, I can definitely understand why connecting them with the why is so key
Yeah.
and engaging right at the end of the day. If you want the team motivated and doing their best work, then that makes a lot of sense to me.
Right.
How would you describe your leadership style? You just shared a bit of a perspective there. Is there anything more to that? And has it evolved over the course of your career? Now you've
Yeah, I
been
mean,
many years in banking?
I've tried to approach it from a way that resonates with me, that's authentic to me. Early in my career in banking, I tried to be a tough guy, and that didn't really work for me. Just not in my personality. I've never been that guy. I don't think I can apply it to a personal or professional setting. I can't summarize it in one word, but I would say I try to treat above and below, depending on where I was in my career at the time, with some level of respect and not look at it in a hierarchical situation. But this is a relationship. If you believe in each other and what you're trying to do, we're all trying to get to this point. Some people do it in different ways. I respect the way you do it, and I hope you do likewise for me. But I think that's just how to operationalize that. But it's just something that works for me and my style. And that's how I try to treat all my interactions as a senior banker.
But I think authenticity is key, right? I couldn't agree more on that front. And I think you've
Yeah.
got to be yourself to be able to succeed and to bring the team with you. From someone who's been in business development and is clearly really good at building relationships, what have you learned about navigating senior relationships? I know we've got a lot of VPs that listen to this podcast, so they're probably thinking, how do they manage up, so to speak, whether that's partners, clients, board members, and building influence at the top. How do you navigate this?
My view on that is probably a little antiquated. I think people that come into the business now probably feel a little bit more empowered than I did when I showed up at Goldman Sachs. But my view of my job at Goldman Sachs is to take, and I heard it framed this way recently from another commentator, was to take as much as I can off the senior person's plate. Right. And so that means I'm doing things that aren't necessarily up to what I perceive to be my level of capabilities. Right. I'm not leveling up between what I think I can do and what I'm being tasked to do or what I think I need to do to solve for that situation. Then I think you got to put that aside and try to, and whether that's, I think it worked for me because I showed up in banking with a lot of content, right? So I think no matter how senior you are as a biotech banker, at some point you're tasked with going into a room of experts, right, in a given therapeutic area, in a given disease, and tell them what your perspective is on why they should do A, B, and C in terms of buying, selling, partnering, etc. And that could be a daunting task for anyone, no matter how many times you've done it, because there's a level of technical depth which I don't think it's very difficult to get comfortable with. So by showing up with content and comfort of being in front of people and talking to people, I was very early put into that position. You come up with the ideas, you go into the room and you pitch it. And I think that's something that worked well for me pretty early on. And I was able to carry through my career.
So it feels like that content, that advantage, that confidence, that client situations and the content brought you enabled you to take more off the seniors and
Yeah,
get
so
more exposure at a higher level. And therefore, it's a good way to manage up. So it makes a lot of sense.
right, I could take that off their plate. And then at the same time, I think as you build that relationship, right, as you've demonstrated, I can go to large cap pharma, I can go to mid cap biotech, I can do all these pitches. I think that gives you a little bit more leeway to think about other ways to develop the relationship. So what I started doing early in my banking career was following up on meetings directly with copying the senior banker, but following up directly with the VP or the director at the BD team we just met and say, oh, this happened, that happened. And I often did that without asking for permission first. All right. And so I think I was allowed that leeway between forgiveness and permission by, I think, going in and, for lack of a better word, falling on that sword in the face-to-face meeting sometimes.
That's a great example because I hear a lot about be proactive, think about the next task before it's needed, play up a role. And that's a really great example of reaching out and whether it's in person or after to
Yeah.
wrap the meeting. So I love
The great and challenging thing about biotech is there's always, and I think in most innovative sectors, there's always something to talk about, right? There's always clinical data. There's always therapeutic areas that are transitioning, oncology, obesity, CV metabolic. You're a rare company, you're a generics company, there's always something happening. So I think there's a pretty broad content set that you can pick from, but I think you've got to be very focused on what you're looking to do with that. And I
How
think
do you
that's the difference between bringing that content through from research and corporate into banking.
how do you stay on top of all that? Given it's such a fast moving and a lot of innovation going on in the sector, how do you stay on top of the content? I guess you have some tips from your skills.
When I started, it was a 24/7 job, and I probably still rely on the content I developed at Goldman in ways that I don't even know about. But that was a 5 year grind of developing different resources and habits of understanding what's happening to the industry and being able to filter that quickly down to what's important. So I think biotech is a place of mega trends, right? And then you see a lot of different things happen beneath that. But I think it's so by difference between what I was doing at Goldman and what I do now is that I'm able to see things at a higher level because that content has developed over time. Right. So
Yeah.
at Goldman, it's all right. I'm reading every press release. I'm working from the bottom up. And now I think I can explain things from more of a top down way, which is when I'm working with the level of executive that I'm paid to work with. I think that's the way that they want to hear it.
Yeah, makes sense. Now, thanks for sharing that. And I guess AI is only going to help probably even further with that process, right?
Yeah, the information scouring aspect of AI, I think, is gonna, and you see it right now on LinkedIn. There's a ton of biopharma stats are analyzed in 100 different ways in these dynamic quick hits that you see posted all the time. And I think if there's a pathway for bankers to utilize that, I think that can be very effective. I haven't seen it harnessed effectively from a peer or on the banking side, but I think that has real potential for sure.
Yeah, I think it's still growing, right? But it's coming. And I guess
Yeah.
with your skills on the research and side, as you grow your knowledge of the tools, it's going to be super. We talked a bit about authenticity, how you bring the why to the team. How do you empower the team while maintaining high standards?
I think you got a challenge, right? And I think it starts with setting the goal and the premise, and then I think at that point you've given the junior team, what they need. If they're going to be honest with themselves, you've given them what they need to go out and do the right level of analysis, and then I think depending on who I'm working with and the complexity of the task determines how much leeway you give that team, right? So if it's someone that you've gone through this particular analysis for this client or someone that's been working on this client with you for an extended period of time, I think you're a little bit more comfortable giving them high level guidance and being more confident that what you get back in that initial draft or that turn, whatever it may be, is getting closer and closer to what your vision is that you'll actually present to the client. So
Got
I
to
think
be.
I think you have to be very explicit when you're working between those two ends of the spectrum in terms of controlling everything that goes into the book and giving your team more leeway. I think you have to be very explicit about level setting expectations with that VP or that associate or whoever within that junior team you think is going to really drive the content and the analysis. Like this, so we've talked about this. I think you should frame the company, frame the strategic matrix, frame the ideas, and you can go do all that and then I'll tweak it when I see it. But I think that's the level of detail and feedback and expectations you need to set for your dream.
So clear guidelines, clear expectations, and then just being there to obviously guide on anything that's
And
off the mark.
yeah, what I expect of you specifically, you VP, you associate, this is what
Mm,
I expect of you specifically now that we've established this framework.
that makes sense. I can again understand how that's easy to connect with for them and engaging. Talk to me a bit about books, because I remember when we were chatting, you had a viewpoint on books in pitches and content and less is more. Could you talk a little bit about that?
There's a couple of different ways to go about it. I think that the book, it was explained to me very early on in one of these management leadership coaching sessions, that the concept of banking is the central premise of it is daunting, right? Like you're going into a CEO, CFO at a big multinational company trying to explain things to them in a way that they perceive or that you have an edge and you're adding value to that strategic decision that executive is trying to make. So it is very daunting, but I think at the basis of that, there has to be some type of relationship beyond just I'm a banker, you're an executive. There has to be some level of trust that's going to allow that executive to bring you into the inner circle and execute on that trade or that deal in the way that you pitched it. And if you start with that, if you believe in the centrality of that relationship, then building that relationship by putting a 50-page book in front of them, in front of you and in front of them, and then flipping that book over time, I think you've got a literal barrier between you and the client in terms of building a relationship. So I've certainly modified that over time and thinking about sometimes you need to lean on a book because you need the analysis and it's a big ask and you need to have all these pages in front of you. But I think my effort is to really distill the strategy of it down to a very discrete set of analyses that I can communicate with or without pages, depending on how the client. So what I often do now is create a handful of pages, send it over to the CEO or the client a day or two, or the morning of, the night before the meeting, and then I show up without anything and have a discussion.
I love that. I love that so much. And I think it was Dominic Lester, head of banking in EMEA, who told me the same thing. Going in and being ready and being there to listen. If you're just going in to talk the whole time, then it's not going to yield
Right.
what you want from the client. So you're really on that same level. I love sending it off and then showing up. And I'm guessing the conversation becomes more interactive and a much more of a sharing scenario versus you just sitting there and pitching, right?
Yeah, and that's what you want, right? I think you want to demonstrate I think the listening is obviously done in the room, right? And that's important. But you can listen now before you even get to the meeting. Like, you should be listening to your client all the time. These
Yeah,
big public companies are always saying something.
yeah,
They're out talking to investors. They're doing quarterly calls. They're doing a call from ASCO. They're doing a call from XYZ medical meeting. So there's always content out there, and that's really your job, to be listening that whole time, not just the week before the meeting and then when you're going into the meeting. It's listening over that time and being able to reflect the fact that you're listening in the analysis that you're presenting to the client.
yeah. Really telling that story, right? As you say, that you've heard it and really connect with that. What else? Again, we've got a lot of VPs, directors as well, listening in. You've got this unique business development background that's giving you this edge in relationship building. What other advice could you share today on relationship building and I guess reaching that trusted advisor role, particularly that everyone's after?
Everyone develops their own style as a banker, and in that position of being in the room on a call with very sophisticated clients that know more about, particularly in biotech, know more about, infinitely more about what they need to do than you can ever know, just given the technical nature of the business. I think it's really putting that aside and thinking about, what are you bringing to the table, right? And what value are you adding on this specific analysis? And that value adding can mean a lot of different things. We hear it get thrown around all the time. But what specifically is your perspective on what they've talked about, and what they've, not only in terms of what they talked about and what they've done, but what they want to do in the future, and how you develop a perspective around that. Always put yourself in the client's shoes about what you think would be interesting for you to hear in that position, and try to push towards that end of the spectrum, versus, I think, what the tendency or the default is to go back to, the template or this or that, or the standard agenda that you've used in a dozen other client meetings. Everything, I think, the analyses are all more or less the same, but framing it for that client is different between meetings. So always put yourself, and I tell that to junior bankers all the time, put yourself in the client's shoes, then put yourself in my shoes. And I've got this page out in front of a client. Again, not the way I necessarily do things, but let's say that's how they built the book, right? That they're showing you is, I've got this page out in front of a client. What do you think I'm going to say? Right? This is okay. This is their stock price. This is what it's done over the past year. They know it. I know they know it, right? They know I know it. So what am I going to say here? Something that simplistic, I think, can be a very good discussion point, and a good way for you to think as a junior banker about how you're advancing and taking things off your senior banker's plate.
I think it's great to putting yourself in that mindset of always thinking as if you're in the client's shoes and actually road testing some of the information you're going to present. I love that. I've
Right.
not
So
heard that
yeah,
before, so it makes
yeah.
sense. We touched on it briefly, I guess, but VPs, one of the big challenges in the industry is moving from that doing to leading. You've been exceptionally good at doing over a period of time, and then suddenly you're more in that seat where you've got to lead others. And I know that happens a lot around that VP level, particularly. What advice would you give someone who's making that leap?
I think when you're at the VP level, it's a very interesting spot, because you're caught in between. I think, as you're suggesting, Peter, you're caught in between two worlds of trying to servicing a senior banker, but also becoming a senior banker yourself. The way I did it is, I just applied the same lessons I use now, and same tendencies and way of doing things that I've instilled right now in my interactions with junior bankers. And I think you just need to start that a little bit early. So I think, to make a very fine point, I think the hardest thing to do as a VP is really to stand up for your junior team, so to speak, right? Is to say, well, I don't know exactly what my senior banker is asking for. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to have that second call, right? We did the first call, we got the email, we understand the outline. I don't really know about A, B, and C. And I think if I don't find out more about A, B, and C, this thing could go sideways. And I don't want it to be sideways for the whole team or for me as a VP. But I think you can sometimes, if you don't have the confidence to go back, or the leadership to go back, or accountability to go back to your senior banker and ask those questions, I think it's also easy to say, all right, let's just go down this road. Because if the work does go sideways, the brunt of that is going to fall on the junior team in terms of how much they need to do in what short period of time.
Powerful stuff, really, isn't it? It seems quite simple, but you got to understand the full picture, and then
Right.
you're obviously going to lead the team better. And I guess that can only stand you in good stead when you move up the ranks to MD and more
Right.
client-facing roles as well. So,
Right. So if
great tip.
I have 20 ideas in oncology. Okay, let me, before I ask the junior team to run 1,000 screens and pick out a bunch of random names. Let me understand a little bit more about what that actually means, what ideas you have as a senior banker for how to refine that search beyond just oncology. And then let me take that back to the junior bankers, and then we could start our process. And I think that, get back to my original points around respect, I think that makes the process better. And from a junior banker perspective, I think looking up, they say, all right, here's a banker, here's a leader within this team or within this bank that really respects my time as a junior banker and is willing to go to bat with a senior banker to help make that time a little bit easier, a little bit more efficient for me as a junior banker.
Yeah, I can imagine that trust and respect builds
Yeah,
quickly, right? When you see
right,
that
exactly.
everyone's busy and working long hours. So yeah, definitely. What advice do you have for aspiring leaders, Aaron, who want to make it to the top of the industry and make partner like you?
Be intellectually curious and don't be afraid to put your opinion out there. I know it from the biotech perspective, it can be very challenging, but I think that most of the people you talk to at least in my travels as a banker, I think if you've put the work into the idea and approached it from all angles and you've been listening to the client, both what they've said to you personally, what they've said publicly, I think they will respect the foundation of the idea, even if it is at the end of the day wrong, right?
Mm.
I think you can go in there and make a big push for XYZ company to get into this therapeutic. I did a pitch for Alnylam a while ago at the height of the gene therapy buzz. Very adamant. You got to do this. You have to do that. If you're going to be in genetic medicine, you really got to do this. Based on the facts of the time, I think, looking in retrospect, I was 100% wrong on that, given
Mm.
where Alnylam has gotten to. But I think to go in there with the confidence of this is how I see you, this is how I see you developing, and this is why this particular asset or thing is important for you, and having that conviction and having done the work behind that, I think if you've done all those things, whether or not the idea holds is one thing, but for the client to see you deliver that type of work and thoughtfulness, I think will put you on the right track to developing their relationship.
Okay, yeah, take a bit of a risk. Obviously, do
Right.
the
Like,
work,
I mean,
but
sometimes, right, you go into a client
yeah,
and say, I mean, you don't say it literally, but you do an analysis that shows there hasn't been a lot of progress on this over time, right? Your investors are thinking one way, you're saying one thing, your investors are thinking another way. Here's a disconnect, and here are some ways to solve that.
yeah,
Right. Which
no,
some clients don't like to hear that, but I think that can be the basis of a very good long term relationship.
yeah, nice, great advice. I really hope our aspiring leaders are listening into this and taking some notes. What motivated you to leave the bulge bracket world and join MTS?
It gets back to, again, for me, it was an aspect of authenticity. I think at this point, I've been doing this for 15 plus years as a banker, 10 years as a managing director partner. I know enough about myself to understand what I'm good at and maybe what I'm not as good at. And I think what I'm not as good at maybe is being the corporate guy. What that means for me is different what it may mean for someone else. But I think what it meant for me is doing things A, B, and C, right? A certain way all the time. This is how we pitch this. This is who needs to be here if you're going to pitch that. And I think for me, it was a little bit restrictive. They were great teams, great leaders across both of my experiences. But I think working at a firm like MTS is much smaller. All we do is healthcare, and I think with a team of that size, we all have to be 100% oriented towards delivering a sole focus of delivering ideas to clients, both on the buy side, sell side partnerships. And I think that level of uniformity around what our mission is helpful for me when that mission is to come up with smart things and ideas to say to clients.
Yeah, so that flexibility, that empowerment, and again, I guess drawing back to the purpose, everyone pulling in the same direction seems to be important for you. So
And,
thanks for
and
sharing.
and I think it's been a year, and the goal is for me personally is to have a great experience both as an individual and as a team at MTS. I think part of that is exercising more of my entrepreneurial spirit or ethos or whatever you want to call it. I've done a couple of different roles, and I think when you have that variety of roles, you do have different things that you need to feed as an individual, as someone trying to develop professionally and personally. And for me, one of those things is being more entrepreneurial, being a little bit more independent. And I thinking through those things and what I wanted to achieve there was part of why the move to MTS was important for me. So I've got my head on a swivel in terms of these are interesting opportunities in industry. A lot of bankers leave banking to go into industry. There's lots of opportunities there, but I feel I still have more to do in banking. And if I could do that in a more entrepreneurial setting, that's what MTS will allow me to do.
Well, your motivation comes through, and I know you're doing a great job in the first year. So I wish you continued luck as you that entrepreneurial spirit. Believe it or not, we're moving towards the wrap already. Time's flown by. So a couple of final questions.
Yeah.
Which books or podcasts or materials would you recommend that have had a big impact on you in your career?
I think if you're in biotech as an analyst, equity research, or banking, get a biology textbook. I still have mine that I bought when I was an analyst at Goldman with the tags and all those things. And so you can
Mhm.
get familiar with the basics of it, right? And then depending on how you best digest information, it's so ubiquitous now, which is a good and a bad thing. There's sometimes too much of it. But if you can get on bio Twitter and you can slowly hone what you want to read and how you want to do it, I think there's a ton of content there. And over time, you'll separate what's important and understand how to digest that. BioCentury is also great, has always been a great resource in the 25 years I've been in the industry. You got to hit that every week. And I think as you're thinking about summer reading, pleasure reading, there's a lot of $1 billion molecule books about Vertex, Genentech, BioMarin, the origins of all these companies, I think really give you a long-term perspective of how the industry is developed and where it can go. It's not direct content, but it'll supports how you think about advising biotech companies over the long term. So I don't think that's the most obvious thing because they're books about what happened in the industry 40 years ago. But I think if you understand that foundational aspect of the industry and how the biggest companies, the biggest biotech companies today started to grow up in that period, from Biogen to Genentech to Alnylam and so forth, I think that's a very interesting piece of perspective to bring to the table in your client discussions.
Yeah, I can understand why that's so powerful to learn and understand how the industry's created and grown, even if it
Right.
was some time ago. Yeah, so definitely connect with that. And last but not least, if you could go back, Aaron, to your early days in the industry, what advice would you give yourself knowing what you know now?
I think to put myself out there a little bit more. And I think to be more proactive about developing different, and I've done a lot of different things. I think there's a ton of different stakeholders in biotech, right? Which is part of why it's so fascinating. You have, investors who are PhDs. You've got a huge regulatory bureaucracy. You've got a massive innovative sector in the middle of that, which is trying to bridge those two pieces. So I think there's a lot of, and particularly in terms of now how easy it is to develop and disseminate content. I think there's a lot of stakeholders where you can build knowledge from on the investor side, on the regulatory side, that you can bring back into your career. So I think seeking those discussions proactively from a point of humility and learning, I think is something I wish I had done a little bit earlier.
What great advice and what a great way to end. So, Aaron, I guess it was F say thanks so much for joining me, especially
Yeah,
when it's nearing summer and I know there's a lot going on in your world. So, really appreciate the time and know the audience are going to love your insights.
great. I appreciate it, Peter. Thank you.
This episode of the podcast was brought to you by the Investment Banking Leaders Club. And to keep leveling up your career, join the club at ibleadersclub.com for exclusive insights, leadership strategies, and career growth resources straight from the industry's top professionals. I want to say thanks to our key partner, Altrum, the global leader in financial deal gifts, awards, and recognition, for their ongoing support of our mission to empower both aspiring and senior investment banking leaders. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thanks for tuning in. And until next time, best of luck on your growth journey.